Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to kind of flip the script a little bit and talk about something that challenges conventional wisdom. It's the unexpected power of introverts. We've got some really interesting excerpts from Susan Cain's book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And we're going to unearth some seriously thought-provoking insights.
You know, it's a topic that I think resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Introversion is really misunderstood, I think. And, sometimes even seen as a liability.
Yeah.
But what we're going to uncover today is that it's actually a source of tremendous strength and influence.
Absolutely. And we'll see that play out in some surprising ways. I mean, Cain's research reveals that introverts are statistically more likely to rise to the top as CEOs.
Wow.
Which is a pretty big deal when you consider how much our culture places on, extroverted traits.
Right.
Especially in the business world.
Yeah, it really challenges that sort of dominant narrative of the charismatic, outspoken leader, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's, I think, one of the key threads that we'll kind of unravel today.
Yeah.
How this extrovert ideal, as Cain calls it, has shaped our perceptions of success and leadership, potentially even causing us to overlook a wealth of talent.
Right. And speaking of challenging perceptions, think about the figures who've sparked revolutions throughout history.
Yeah.
What comes to mind?
I mean, usually it's the, loud, charismatic, maybe even a bit of a showman.
A showman, yeah. But what if we look close? I mean, think about Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
Quiet, unassuming, yet her simple act of defiance on that segregated bus ignited a movement.
Yeah, her quiet strength, I think, really forces us to reconsider that whole idea that leadership is all about outward charisma.
Right.
And her actions demonstrate a different kind of power, one that's rooted in conviction and quiet determination.
Right. It makes you wonder if we've been defining leadership too narrowly, focusing on style over substance.
And that's a key insight from Cain's book. She argues that American culture, particularly in the business world, has come to overvalue extroverted traits, sometimes at the expense of substance and thoughtful leadership.
She goes really deep into this whole extrovert ideal thing.
She does. She traces it all the way back to figures like Dale Carnegie.
Oh, wow.
Whose self-help empire was built on teaching people how to win friends and influence people.
Right.
And this emphasis on charisma and self-promotion, it really became ingrained in American society. And it shaped everything from business practices to educational philosophy.
So, I mean, it even impacted elite universities like Harvard.
Oh, yeah. Even Harvard got caught up in it.
Yeah.
They were seeking out the gregarious student.
Right.
Not the, sensitive, neurotic type, as they put it back then.
Wow.
So Cain's book really reveals how this preference for extroversion became the norm.
Yeah.
Influencing hiring practices and even shaping educational goals.
It's almost like we've created a system that rewards a certain personality type without even realizing it. But to really understand the impact of all of this, we need to understand what introversion actually is.
And that's where the science comes in.
Yeah.
Cain delves into the fascinating research that reveals the biological basis of introversion.
Okay.
So it's not just a personality quirk. It's actually rooted in the way our brains are wired.
One of the researchers she highlights is Dr. Jerome Kagan.
Yes, Dr. Kagan's work on temperament was really groundbreaking. He conducted these studies where babies were exposed to new sights and sounds.
Okay.
And what he found was fascinating. Those who reacted really strongly, like crying or thrashing their arms, they were much more likely to become introverted later in life.
Oh, wow.
These highly reactive babies, as he called them, were more sensitive to stimuli right from the start.
So it's not just a preference, it's literally how they're wired.
Exactly. And further research showed that this sensitivity is linked to the amygdala.
Okay.
That part of the brain that processes emotions.
Right.
And in introverts, the amygdala is more easily stimulated, meaning they react more intensely to sensory input.
So it's not that they're choosing to be more reserved. Their brains are literally wired to respond differently.
That's it. And Dr. Carl Schwartz's research using fMRI technology confirmed this.
Wow.
Even when introverts learn to navigate social situations, their amygdalae remain more sensitive than those of extroverts.
That's fascinating. So it's not just behavior or upbringing. There's an actual biological basis for these differences.
Exactly. And this understanding is crucial, I think, because it challenges the whole notion that introversion is something to be fixed.
Right.
Instead, it reframes it as a natural temperament with its own unique strengths.
I like that.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see that introversion isn't a weakness.
Yeah.
It's a different way of experiencing and interacting with the world.
Absolutely.
And this different wiring actually translates into some pretty amazing strengths, especially when it comes to leadership.
And that's what we're going to talk about next.
Okay, awesome. I can't wait.
Yeah. It might seem counterintuitive given, our culture's emphasis on extroverted leaders, but Cain's research reveals that a significant number of highly successful CEOs are actually introverts.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those who, might be perceived as quiet or reserved can end up leading some of the most impactful companies.
It really highlights how we need to kind of broaden our understanding of what effective leadership really looks like. Introverts, with their tendency to think deeply and to consider things carefully, often possess qualities that are really essential for successful leadership.
So what are some of those specific qualities that make introverts such strong leaders?
Well, for one, they tend to be excellent listeners.
Okay.
They take the time to really understand different perspectives before making decisions. And this can create a more inclusive and collaborative environment where, team members feel heard and valued.
It's not about being the loudest voice in the room.
Right.
It's about, creating space for others to contribute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Introverted leaders are also often very thoughtful and deliberate in their decision-making.
Right.
They don't rush into things. They weigh the options carefully. And they're not afraid to seek out different perspectives. And this can lead to, more strategic and well-considered choices, which is crucial for long-term success.
Now, Cain highlights this concept of level 5 leaders from Jim Collins's book, Good to Great.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of those qualities align really well with introverted strengths.
Absolutely. Level 5 leaders, they're characterized by this unique blend of humility and unwavering resolve.
Okay.
So they're not driven by ego or the need for personal recognition. They're more focused on building strong teams and achieving lasting results.
Yeah.
And as Cain points out, these qualities are often found in introverted leaders who lead by example and really empower others to excel.
She even provides examples of some successful introverted CEOs like Bill Gates, Charles Schwab, Darwin Smith of Kimberly-Clark. These weren't, the stereotypical charismatic backslapping CEOs, but they were incredibly effective in their own way.
Their success really challenges our assumptions about leadership, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
It suggests that we may be overlooking a huge pool of talent.
Yeah.
By clinging to this narrow definition of what a leader should be.
It makes you wonder, if introverts have all these leadership advantages, why is there still such a strong emphasis on extroversion in our culture?
It's a deeply ingrained cultural bias.
Yeah.
And it extends beyond the realm of leadership. We see it in the way we approach teamwork, creativity, even our education system.
Cain talks about this idea of the new groupthink, where collaboration is often seen as the ultimate solution.
Right.
Sometimes to the detriment of individual thinking and creativity.
Yeah, and while collaboration is undoubtedly valuable, I think it's important to recognize that solitude is also essential for deep thinking and, that innovative problem solving. Sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas come when we have the space to think independently and to explore unconventional paths.
She uses the example of Steve Wozniak.
Oh, yeah? Who created the first Apple computer while working alone in his garage.
Yeah, that's a classic example of how solitude can really fuel innovation.
Right. And there's research to back that up.
Right.
A study on violinists found that the most accomplished ones actually spent more time practicing alone than their less successful counterparts. They understood that solo practice was crucial for honing their skills and developing their own unique style.
That's really interesting.
This makes me think about my own work habits. Do I actually carve out enough time for focused solitary work?
Yeah.
Or am I constantly trying to brainstorm and collaborate? Maybe missing out on those moments of deep thinking that lead to breakthroughs.
It's a question worth pondering, I think. Perhaps we all need to kind of reevaluate our relationship with solitude.
Yeah.
And recognize its value, not just for introverts, but for anyone seeking to tap into their creative potential.
So we've seen how introversion can be an asset in leadership and creativity.
Right.
But it seems like cultural perceptions can play a huge role in how introversion is perceived and valued.
And Cain's book explores some really fascinating differences between Western and Eastern cultures in this regard.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. While Western cultures, particularly in the U.S., tend to, emphasize extroverted traits.
Right.
Many Eastern cultures such as, those found in China and Japan, hold a very different perspective.
Okay.
They tend to value quietude and restraint, viewing these qualities as signs of intelligence and thoughtfulness.
It's almost a complete reversal of the extrovert ideal we've been talking about.
It is.
Yeah.
In these cultures, speaking up too much or seeking the spotlight can be seen as inappropriate or even disrespectful.
Oh, wow.
There's a strong emphasis on listening, observing, and choosing your words carefully.
It's interesting how even proverbs reflect these cultural differences.
Yeah.
Cain mentions the Asian proverb, "The duck that quacks is the first to get shot," which really highlights the value placed on restraint.
That's a good one.
And then there's the proverb, "Silence is a source of great strength," which speaks to the power of introspection and observation.
I like that one.
It seems like in these cultures, introversion isn't just accepted, it's actually admired.
To a large extent, yes.
Yeah.
And this difference in cultural perspectives is not just anecdotal. There's scientific evidence to support it.
Oh, really?
Cain mentions this fMRI study where researchers showed pictures of dominant and submissive poses to American and Japanese participants.
Okay.
And interestingly, the dominant poses activated pleasure centers in the American brains,
Wow.
while the submissive poses did the same for the Japanese.
That's a pretty powerful illustration of how deeply ingrained these cultural values can be, right down to our neurological responses.
It really highlights how our cultural environment shapes our perceptions and values,
Yeah.
sometimes in ways we're not even aware of.
Right. But what happens when these cultural perspectives clash?
Well, Cain explores that in her book.
Okay.
She talks about Cupertino, California,
Mm-hmm.
which is a city with a large Asian American population.
Yeah.
So these kids grow up in a community that values quietude and restraint. But then they step outside of that bubble and they encounter the American extrovert ideal, often for the first time.
It must be such a jarring experience. It's like being told that the qualities you've been taught to value are suddenly seen as liabilities.
It can be a real challenge.
Mm.
Cain shares the story of Mike Way, a student from Cupertino who went to Stanford.
Yeah, okay.
He felt this intense pressure to be more extroverted than he really was, like he had to constantly be hyped up, even when it felt inauthentic.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the kids who might be going through similar experiences, feeling like they have to suppress their true selves to fit in.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if our culture is doing a disservice to those who don't naturally conform to the extrovert ideal.
It's a valid concern. Cain's work raises important questions about how our cultural biases might be limiting us, preventing us from recognizing and nurturing a wider range of talents and perspectives.
It seems like embracing a more inclusive perspective on personality could be a huge benefit, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
That's the crux of Cain's argument. She challenges us to rethink our assumptions about introversion and extroversion, and to recognize the value of both.
Yeah, it's like we've been operating with this limited definition of success and leadership,
Right.
overlooking the incredible potential of those who just thrive in a different way.
Absolutely. And, Cain doesn't just highlight the challenges. She offers a path forward.
Okay.
She introduces this really fascinating concept called soft power,
Okay.
which really resonates, I think, with the strengths of introverts.
I'm curious about that. What is soft power, and how does it relate to introversion?
Well, it's a form of influence that's not based on force or dominance.
Okay.
It's based on persuasion through quiet persistence, careful listening, and thoughtful action. It's about leading by example and building consensus, rather than demanding attention or asserting authority.
So it's more about subtle influence and building relationships
That's like
than, commanding a room.
Exactly. And Cain argues that this approach can be incredibly effective,
Okay.
perhaps even more so than the traditional forceful approach, especially in certain situations.
She uses some compelling examples in the book to illustrate this, right?
Yeah, she talks about Professor Nee, who teaches a class on American business culture to international students.
Okay.
Many of his students come from Asian cultures where soft power is very highly valued.
Right.
And they're often taken aback by the American emphasis on self-promotion and assertiveness.
Yeah, it must be a real culture shock for them going from an environment that values restraint to one that prizes, outspokenness.
It is. Professor Nee helps them navigate this new landscape,
Yeah.
encouraging them to speak up more and to, project confidence.
Mm-hmm.
But he also emphasizes that they don't have to completely abandon their natural style.
So it's about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Learning to adapt to the situation
Yeah.
while still staying true to yourself.
Exactly. And this idea of balance is important not just for individuals, but for teams and organizations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cain argues that having a mix of personalities, both introverts and extroverts, can create a more dynamic and productive environment.
Because if everyone's trying to be the loudest voice in the room,
All right.
chaos is probably more likely than progress.
Exactly. You need a diversity of thought and approaches to effectively solve problems and innovate. Introverts, with their tendency for thoughtful analysis and careful consideration, they bring a valuable perspective to the table.
So it's about recognizing that different strengths are needed in different situations
Yeah,
and valuing the contributions of those who might not fit the traditional mold.
precisely. It's about creating a culture that celebrates both the quiet power of introverts and the dynamic energy of extroverts.
Now, Cain also talks about this idea of free traits,
Yeah.
which I found really empowering.
It's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
It basically means that we're not limited by our inherent temperament. We can actually act out of character when it's important to us.
So even though an introvert might naturally prefer solitude, they can step outside their comfort zone and be more outgoing and assertive when the situation calls for it.
Exactly. Cain uses the example of Professor Brian Little,
Okay.
who's actually an introvert himself,
Huh.
but has to, give lectures and presentations as part of his job.
Right.
So he's developed strategies for managing his anxiety and performing well in these situations, creating what he calls restorative niches to kind of recharge between engagements.
So he's found a way to balance the demands of his profession with his need for solitude and downtime.
Yeah, it's a great example of how we can stretch ourselves and adapt to different situations without losing sight of who we are.
And it's an important message for anyone who feels pressured to be on all the time.
Right.
It means that you can honor your natural inclinations while still succeeding in a world that often values a different way of being.
Absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the power of introversion, what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should consider?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that introversion is not a weakness. It's just a different way of being, a way of being that comes with its own unique strengths and value.
Couldn't agree more.
We need to challenge the cultural biases that privilege extroversion.
Yeah.
And recognize the contributions of introverts in all aspects of society, from leadership to innovation to, creative pursuits.
Absolutely. We've seen how introversion can be a tremendous asset in leadership,
Right.
how it can fuel creativity and deep thinking, and how cultural perspectives really shape the way it's perceived and valued.
And, maybe most importantly, we've learned that we're not confined to these rigid categories.
Yeah.
We can adapt and stretch ourselves, drawing on both our introverted and extroverted qualities to navigate the world in a way that feels authentic and fulfilling.
And on that note, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final thought. Imagine a world where we truly valued the full range of human personality. A world where the quiet strengths of introverts and the dynamic energy of extroverts were equally celebrated. What kind of possibilities might open up?
It's an inspiring vision, one where everyone feels empowered to contribute their unique talents and perspectives. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the power of introversion, I highly recommend checking out Susan Cain's book, Quiet. It's a really thought-provoking and insightful read that can really challenge your assumptions and broaden your understanding of this often misunderstood personality trait.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing the power of quiet.
And remember, sometimes the most profound insights come from those who listen more than they speak.